Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name is Toby, and today I'm joined by two guests from the world of scientific publishing, specifically open access publishing. They are Dr. Frederick Fenter, who is the Chief Executive Editor for the Frontiers portfolio of research journals, with a storied career in academic publishing and a research background in atmospheric chemistry, and Stephan Kuster, a political scientist by training who has served as Secretary General of the research network Science Europe and advised the European Commission on science policy and is now head of institutional affairs at the very same Frontiers. So Fred and Stephan, welcome both of you to the podcast. Thanks in advance for your time.
Hello.
Thanks, Toby. Great to be here.
So I know both of you are active in science policy circles and ambassadors on the brave new publishing frontier, pun intended, I suppose, of open science. And I've no doubt that we could have a fascinating conversation on that topic someday, but today is not that day. Today, instead, I have in front of me a report that you published, that Frontiers published, at the end of 2020 called The Academic Response to COVID-19. Which I think has some very interesting stuff in it, not least about science advice and science for policy. So to get the ball rolling, perhaps I could invite you to say a few words about this report and why it exists.
Yeah. When the COVID pandemic hit last springtime, we realized that in terms of interacting with our editorial boards, the context changed very, very quickly. Instead of having in-person editorial summit meetings, we began to organize these large thousands of editorial members coming together around these virtual events. And we really felt a very strong sense of community. We felt a sense that it was important for them to join in on these discussions, and it was quite an event to experience. It came to us that there was not a lot of information out there about how scientists were actually living, what they were experiencing, what they were going through in this COVID crisis. And so we decided to just do a survey, to ask them a couple of pointed questions about how they were working, whether they were able to maintain continuity, how they felt that their own voice was being listened to, et cetera. And so this was actually one of the points, one of the actions that we took in terms of trying to understand how scientists were experiencing this pandemic. And I have to just point out that Frontiers has about 200,000 scientists that belong to its various editorial boards across the 100 journals or so that we publish. And so we're actually quite lucky to have this large international group of scientists to tap into to ask these types of questions.
Yeah, thinking back to the time when we were designing the survey, we were very aware that people in this special circumstances that we had, especially at the beginning of the pandemic in March, where the disruption was major and no one really knew where things were going, we were conscious that we couldn't, ask people to reply to a survey with 1,000 questions or a huge burden. So we really tried to ask a small number of questions that would give us interesting insights. And pretty quickly, we realized that funding is something that researchers are very often very aware of, if not concerned about. So this would be interesting to see in the context of this COVID pandemic. And in particular, policy advice or the scientific advice to policymakers was something that from one day to the next appeared on the front pages of newspapers. So we thought we'd ask this community how they perceived the advice that policymakers were receiving and the use they were making of that. That's why these two aspects feature prominently in the survey as well.
And I see this report was published in October 2020, but when was the actual research done? When were the questions asked?
Well, the survey was conducted with Qualtrics in May and June 2020. And so there was a total of 25,300 respondents from 152 countries. And almost 18,000 people completed the entire survey. So, and the answers to the survey were completely anonymous.
Gotcha. I mean, this is a big piece of work, right? That's a big sample size. And although you say you wanted to keep it fairly light on the questions, there's still a good amount of detail in there. And you had a good response rate. So congratulations on that. So I think it's pretty hard to think of anyone whose lives haven't been affected by the pandemic. It's been a universal impact, I think. But as you say, this is an interesting group of people to study, to find out specifically, I guess, both how scientists were affected directly, but also what they thought of the whole thing and how science was being used and so on. So broadly on those two areas, what were the headlines? What did you discover?
Well, I think one of the important results that came out was that most people were able to continue with their work more or less with a certain degree of continuity. So they weren't overly disrupted. They felt that they were able to continue their work adequately. And as a scientific publisher, we absolutely saw that, because one of the sub questions is which type of work were you doing in this period? And a lot of it had to do with writing up past work and submitting new publications. And we actually did see quite a few publications come through, an increase in publications in general across the program during this first sort of confinement period, the first wave of the epidemic. So, yeah, so one is that the day-to-day work had not been significantly affected.
Well, I think coupled to that, so one thing is the resilience that you mentioned. The other thing that struck me is the willingness expressed by these communities to chip in. One of the questions was whether they were, ready to reappropriate their labs or their infrastructure to do research on that would serve solving the COVID situation. And the answer overwhelmingly was yes, and also the willingness to participate in task forces, in providing advice to policymakers, and in just getting involved. Reading the survey and even looking at the raw data gave us a sense of this is a community that wants to be engaged.
Yeah, and so, at Frontiers, what we see is that this desire to step in and make a contribution actually happened across all subject areas. And I think that's also an interesting point to point out. Everybody from mechanical engineers to people studying urban mobility to people who are working on the mental health aspects of COVID, they all came and organized editorial projects to try to gain insights into these aspects of the pandemic. These scientists, our editors, felt a call to contribute where they could in order to make their contribution.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, describe it as a sense of community, but not just in a kind of opportunistic way. Like, suddenly I can join these 1,000-strong virtual meetings and I feel like I'm part of something big, or even suddenly I can't go into the lab, but that means I've got time to finish that paper I've been working on for ages. So not only like an opportunity in that way, but also an opportunity for the community to pull together and each person to find a way to contribute to this big project that crosses all disciplines and impacts on the whole world. So, I mean, I admit these are scientists, so these are not people perhaps whose livelihoods have been shredded by the pandemic by and large, one would hope. But still, that kind of feedback is a real contrast from some of the tales of doom and gloom that we might have expected to hear in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the impression we got is we were expecting, as you say, doom and gloom or at least some negative, pessimistic views here. And the first impression we got is the opposite of that, is a very positive outlook. And as I said, a willingness to be engaged and solving a problem. Now, if you look more in detail at the data, there are clearly also differences here, regional differences. If you look at countries, for example, in the global south, where working from home is not necessarily as common or as easily done as in the global north or in some countries, you see a difference. You see more people reporting disruption in the countries where you cannot just from one day to the next decide to work from home.
Yeah, there's two dimensions, I suppose. So there's the disruption to people's working lives, personal lives, home circumstances, which is different all over the world and different between different people, but also not just unique to scientists. Mm. And then there's the second dimension, which is more specific to the science community, about the special contribution that they feel they can make or want to be able to make to the policy response or to understanding the virus as scientists, which is perhaps what we should focus this conversation.
Yeah.
But before we go there, if I may, I just wanted to get a couple of contextual things out of the way for the benefit of listeners who might not have seen the survey. So we're talking about, as we said, 25,000 respondents or so, many of whom answered all the questions or most of them. But who are these people, other than, as we've been saying, scientists? Where are they from? What kind of areas do they work in?
So we did not require people to give a full profile in terms of describing themselves. So we have good indications about subject areas and levels of seniority. We do know that, for example, the largest number of respondents came from demographics like the U.S. and in Europe. But we did get responses from a total of 152 countries, and the gender breakdown was more or less balanced. I think if we're going to talk about sort of like the nature of the cohort, one thing that's interesting about it is that these are members of our own editorial boards. And we are an open access publisher. And so if we're selecting for something which is sort of non-statistical, it's probably we're working with people who have a very strong sense of the importance of open access, open science principles. So I think that's one thing that needs to be kept in mind when looking at the survey in general, in terms of the nature of the people who replied to the questions. Other than that, we're very careful about who we select as editors and members of our editorial boards. And so what we have, I think, is a very representative cross-section of people working at relatively high-level academic positions around the world. So I think that in that sense, we have a very representative group of people across the world, even if we do have this slight leaning towards people that support open science practices.
There was one other detail of this that I was trying to hammer out, because this comes up frequently, as you probably know, in international conversations about science. And I think it's relevant in understanding the perspective of respondents here. And that's whether these are scientists in the more narrow, like English language sense, meaning people who work in natural and social sciences, or whether it's also supposed to include the humanities and so on. And I got confused about that because at first I thought the answer was yes, it's researchers in all disciplines. That's what the headline suggests anyway. But then when I looked at the breakdown of disciplines at the back of the report, I see that it actually skews extremely heavily towards medicine and biology, which add up to more than twice as much as everyone else put together. And I think humanities and social sciences all grouped together are only about 4% of total respondents.
Yeah.
So how come? Is this because your editorial boards are mostly made up of medics and biologists, or does it tell us something about who was interested in the survey, or what?
No, it's just simply a consequence of the fact that we started our publishing in neuroscience, and then we initially expanded in biological and medical areas, and the humanities and social science programs were developed much later. So our first journal was published in about 2007 in neuroscience, and then it's only been a few years that we've worked to develop the humanities and social science program.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I think it's good to be clear on who the respondents actually are in the main.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of other stuff in here. And what's most interesting, maybe for this podcast, as I mentioned, is not so much the insight we get into how individual scientists have been affected by the pandemic, but also things like how they saw the role of science as a whole and how it's been used, in their view, more widely in the public debate and by policymakers. What kind of picture do you think emerges from these aspects of the study?
So as Fred already mentioned when we were describing the cohort, these are people who have already a sort of positive view of open science, right? And let's say maybe the basic principle of open science is sharing your results, sharing your data. So that is one result that at first sight may be surprising to see, that there is a high number of respondents reporting when we ask them, are you willing to share your data more? Or share your publications more and publish in open access, a lot of them said they don't want to change their behavior. And you can only understand that response if you know that the cohort is already biased towards open access. So not changing the behavior means not moving away from open access and not moving away from sharing the data.
The other thing that might make sense in this context is that we've seen a lot of people making the link towards environmental problems, global warming specifically. What's happened in COVID is that people, of course we have a pandemic that has struck, but it does invite people to think a little bit more seriously about the consequences of other threats. And how those threats might best be addressed, both through practices in scientific publishing and through policy. And I think that this is also one of the reasons why we moved to develop the Policy Labs project at Frontiers, because there was a very heightened awareness of the fact that in order to address these issues that we're confronted with, for example, the climate change, we have to do a much better job in terms of translating the results of scientific research in a language that can be that's actionable from people that in a decisional context.
Yeah, we did ask them the question, if there's something you can ask of policymakers, what do you as a researcher need from policymakers most? And the two top answers were more investment in basic research and better ways for science to advise policy and decision making. So this was also very interesting that these are the top concerns of this community in the context of COVID. I guess funding is always a concern, so this was not surprising. It was surprising, though, to see that it's investment in basic research. So even in a very, acute situation where a lot of the science needed was applied science, the concern here was about more investment for basic research and thinking in the long term. So this was quite telling.
Right. I mean, just to say that another way, in the heart of a pandemic, you would think that people would want to sort of pool the resources in a very focused way to solve the problem. But the answer was basically, let's not lose the focus. Let's not overly invest in one subject area, and let's not have this perturb the progress that we're making in all the other fields. So I think that's something that came across also.
So we're talking about the need for basic research, not just in, say, biomedical areas or areas that are directly relevant to medicine or epidemiology, but across the board.
Correct. Yeah. Talking to certain people who work in the environmental area, their initial concern was that a lot of the progress, a lot of momentum, a lot of the awareness that they had been building for a long period of time might have been sort of pushed to the side or neglected in the context of the pandemic, and to the point even where there were various proposals made to attach, because the pandemic forces us to think about the function of society from top to bottom. And why not, while we're doing this evaluation, keep in mind the fact that we're also confronted with an important environmental risk, and insist that we're putting money specifically into these research projects, but let's invite everyone to think about at the same time, as I'm solving this problem with the pandemic, what are the consequences in terms of the environmental implications of the work that I'm doing?
So again, as well as a challenge, also an opportunity to improve things. So as you mentioned, basic science funding is a priority for respondents, but then so is the opportunity for science to engage with policymakers. A lot of people said they thought science should inform policy better, that their areas have something more to contribute to policy than is currently the case. But then you also asked them a follow-up question. Okay, do you think that you yourself or your organization are able to be part of that? And in answer to that question, 4% of people said yes. So what's the gap? Do you have any insights about why there's that difference between the willingness for it to happen and the willingness to be involved?
Well, the survey itself does not give us any better understanding of that, but we did discuss some of the findings of the survey with experts in the field, including in the field of scientific advice. And one thing that came across and can be a tentative explanation for this is that scientific advice is not a game for the masses, if you want. In the end, the way it is organized in most countries is a small group, either a permanent commission or an ad hoc task force focused on one subject, will in the end be advising either a government, a local authority, and so on. So I think on the one hand, it expresses an awareness of this, that most scientists, they want that mechanism to work well, but they not necessarily want to be part of that small group. It's a very exposed position. As a scientist, you expose yourself to harsh reaction and criticism from anyone who doesn't agree with not only with your advice, but also with the ultimate decision made by the decision makers based on your advice. And also, people finding this important does not mean that they want necessarily to do it personally. I think this may be a reflection of that, of people saying, we need a mechanism that works, but my role is not being in that mechanism. My role may be in the lab, providing the science that mechanism will then use to provide advice.
Right, which then brings us to the question of those mechanisms which exist and how well they're working. And I think it's not that this study provides a particular insight into the detail of science advice mechanisms, but it's interesting because it provides the perspective of essentially rank and file scientists on how well they're performing, how well the mechanisms are performing. So the question you asked here was, how well do you think your government is using science advice, basically? And respondents had a wide range of views, a range of levels of confidence in the use of evidence by their own governments. So are there any correlations, or do you have any insights about what made some scientists apparently pretty positive and others quite negative?
The correlation, if I'm honest, is pretty direct. We asked this question in the context of the first wave, so that's something worth mentioning, right? So we're talking about the period between March and May. But immediately, the countries where the respondents agree with the statement that policymakers have taken advice into account are countries that have, at that time, were faring better in terms of containing the virus and preventing, high death rates or oversaturating the ICU system. So you have countries like New Zealand at the very top, Greece, China, despite being sort of at the origin, very quickly contained the outbreak. Denmark, Germany all feature very highly here in that ranking. And towards the bottom of that ranking, you see countries that at that time were faring less well or pretty badly. You have Russia, UK, Brazil, and the US at the very bottom. So in a sense, yes, that correlation is there. But what cannot strike or underline enough is the fact that this is not a survey of people who participate in government advice mechanism. This is a survey of the academic community. So the overwhelming majority of the respondents were just in the same way that we were spectators of what was going on and were not involved in providing advice. So this is a perception of what was going on, right? And it captures opinions. And it's, I think, a very natural opinion that if your country was faring well at that point and was receiving advice, because as I said earlier, the fact that scientific advice was being provided was on every front page of a newspaper. Every evening in the news, you saw scientific task forces reporting. So the fact that people saw scientific advice was being given, if your country was faring well, you assumed the advice was being followed. And if your country was not doing well, you assumed your country was not following the advice.
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand the survey results at face value. Like, as you said, we're not asking science advisors if they think their advice is being taken. But still, I mean, well, firstly, as I said, I think it's an interesting data point in itself to understand what the science community thinks of how their work essentially is being used. And secondly, I mean, you're right, these are not people who are directly involved in the process mostly, but they're also not just, let's say, uninterested passers-by. They're people who you might expect, on average, will be following the situation quite closely and maybe understand some more of the detail than non-scientists.
Absolutely. So these people were probably following these sort of stories much more closely than a non-academic audience, right? So they were taking this very seriously. It was important, or is still important for them, that science advice is given and is used. So yeah, I believe that to be the case.
And I just kind of wonder, we've been through 2 or 3 waves of the COVID pandemic. And at this point, I really wonder to what extent the debates have more centered on just the logistics of, for example, organizing vaccination programs. And, if you look at certain countries that have had, they go through waves of initially people feeling that they've done a good job. This survey was conducted 6 months ago. And so, it's one point in time. It would be very interesting just to recontact people and find out how they feel now that that's played out a little bit, whether they think that their government has been doing a good job. Specifically on whether or not they've done a good job organizing a response, or a good job in terms of listening to what the scientists have to say. So I think that those are somehow 2 slightly different issues.
This is, I think, undoubtedly a softball question, but I do want to ask you about the link between open access publishing and science for policy. So I know open access is basically your business model at Frontiers, and I don't really want to go too far into the broad debate about that because I know it's a whole big issue in itself. But keeping our focus a bit narrower, it does seem like you have some interesting readouts from this survey about the effects of the pandemic on the future of open access and people's attitudes towards it. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that you talked before about opportunity, and I think that what's happened in this the pandemic context is that people's minds opened to looking at the big picture and trying to step back and maybe abandon some of their a prioris about the way science is conducted. That is an opportunity. And this is one of the reasons why we started working with the Policy Labs project, where we had the coronavirus hub. I think we know that this was an opportunity to show people that scientific research that is published should be openly and immediately available. And that is the only way that it is going to maximally benefit society at large. In an emergency, it's absurd that the results of scientific research are locked behind paywalls. And to the point where even the subscription-based publishers, they made the same realization, and they opened up all of their articles that were behind paywalls. They made them freely available because they understood that this is a situation of such importance that this knowledge has to be freely available without any impediment. Now, the idea is just simply that people should be able to very simply extrapolate to the other types of problems that we're confronted with. If you're talking about respiratory illness, it affects tens of millions of people a year. It kills literally millions of people a year. Why should that not be handled with the same sort of urgency as a viral pandemic? If you look at the threats of the climate change, why is that something that should not also be regarded as something which is of such importance that all of the scientific information that has been generated around that not be immediately available to the scientific community so they can build upon that and people can start translating this to inform the public. So what I'd like to think is that this COVID pandemic has helped to open people's eyes in terms of why open science is the most effective way forward in terms of translating the results of scientific research into solutions to the challenges we face. And let me just point out that funders have also come to the exact same conclusion. And there have been programs that have been set up. Stephan will say a few words about the coalition of funders that have worked to try to work towards this exact outcome, because they also see that they're funding the science, and what they would like is that the knowledge that is generated through these programs is optimally reusable by the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, COVID didn't bring about the open science movement. The open science movement has been there for much longer and actually recently gained momentum by exactly what Fred says, the funders realizing the power and the role they can play here by, for example, in the context of Plan S, mandating open access publication of results that were funded with public money. So the movement was already there, the momentum was there, and I think COVID delivers the ultimate proof. If anyone needed another piece of proof of the relevance and the urgency of this, COVID has provided it. Now, on the other side of that, of course, changing the academic system and how science works is not going to happen overnight. So there's going to be a cultural change driven by the evidence that COVID has provided of the impact of open science, but that is going to take several months or years. Sharing your results needs to be rewarded as a behavior for scientists. In the context of COVID, the reward is faster treatments, the vaccines, and so on. So the reward is tangible and is there. But doing the same thing in climate change. Of course, the solutions to mitigating climate change is going to be a type of reward, but you also need rewards in terms of what it means for the careers of scientists and of this community that we surveyed. So you need real incentives to share your work openly and to be rewarded for that type of behavior.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that some of our editors that we've talked to recently pointed out that the scientific community was fully aware of the threats of a coronavirus pandemic. It's a scenario that has been very, very well studied, and certain sectors of the scientific community were quite aware of the fact that a coronavirus pandemic was a threat of a relatively high probability. So this, again, in parallel to that, we know that the environmental threats is also a outcome of a very high probability. So we have to try to use this use case to show people that, yes, scientists are able to identify threats and able to propose solutions, able to provide contexts that provide a decisional framework. And this pandemic has played out very much along the lines of what had been predicted by scientists. Now let's take the word of scientists more seriously when they warn us about what's going to happen in other contexts.
Yeah, that's a theme that's come up quite a lot when we've been talking about science advice in the pandemic. I remember a few months ago we had a Cambridge researcher on the podcast, Clarissa Rios Rojas, who works on existential risks to humanity. So not just pandemics, but things like AI-related threats. And she said that since the pandemic, suddenly one big challenge about her job has got a lot easier. And that challenge is to convince policymakers and other audiences, I guess, that this stuff that scientists worry about is worth taking seriously. I think from where I'm sitting, the jury is still out on how long that effect will last, whether there'll be like a honeymoon period when these big issues are high on the agenda, and then they'll gradually slide down again as normal life resumes. I don't know. One thing that we can see from this survey, though, is that kind of immediate impact of taking stuff seriously has effects on both sides of the science policy divide as well. So it's not just that politicians might start taking these things seriously for now, but also that scientists have suddenly felt the impulse and the kind of empowerment to roll their sleeves up and say, okay, my time has come, I can really help the world here, let's go. So I want to know whether you think these collective, how to put it, this kind of collective renewal and refocusing of effort and resources and optimism on big issues is something that will last on the scientist side of the fence.
I think that the first element to a question about that is the fact that a very high percentage of the people that responded in the survey felt that they had a contribution to make in order to be able to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic. So I think that at the point in time when this survey was taken, there was a sense that action is possible, and that my role as an expert is one which can provide a contribution towards a solution. I think that I would kind of hesitate personally to extrapolate any further than that, simply because it was a question that was asked rather early in the pandemic. I think it would be extremely interesting to go back, 2 or 3 months from now, and ask a second series of questions, and just to see how these different attitudes have evolved. It is possible that this initial impulse to say yes, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to convert my lab, I'm going to see how my specific field of study can provide useful insights in this emergency. Maybe a year later, that will be frustration rather than feeling a strong call to action. I think it would be interesting to see whether that's the case.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, yes, it would indeed be very interesting. If you do decide to go back to your sample and do round 2, I would love to hear about it. So it remains only to me to thank both of you very much indeed for your time and your insights. It's been really interesting. Fred Fenter and Stephan Kuster, many thanks.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much, Toby.
Yep.
The Science for Policy podcast is produced by SAPEA. We're a consortium of Europe's academies and learning societies, and we're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism. We provide evidence and expertise to inform the work of the group of chief scientific advisors. SAPEA is funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 programme for research and innovation, and you can find lots more information about us and our work at sapea.info. Finally, the rather lovely cello music that's playing right now is performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko, so I shall shut up and let you enjoy the last few bars. Bye for now.